play. Okay, everyone, we're big on starting on time, so I will just say a few introductory words. My name is Valerie Haitina. I'm Hebrew Public. I'm also a parent at HLA of a fifth grader, and I have a graduate from that school as well. Our mission, Hebrew Public's mission, is to run a network of schools that are open to all of the kids, that provide excellent education and teach Hebrew as a second language and prepare our students to become global citizens. I know that people are still joining, and I want to remind everybody that we're a national network. We have 3 schools in New York City, 2 in Brooklyn, 1 in Harlem. We have a school in East Brunswick, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, San Diego, Los Angeles, and we're going to be opening 1 more school on Staten Island. Alina is a friend of the organization, and her family have been involved before Harlem has started. Her mother-in-law has been one of the founding board members of Harlem Hebrew. And if you ever met Celia, the force, the energy, she's just somebody who inspires. And we have created a special fund in memory of Celia, who really cared about the school and the children's well-being. So we asked for suggested donations in honor of Celia for this event. And most importantly, I'm glad to see Alina, who's continuing a family tradition of being involved with our school. Her husband is a board member of Harlem Hebrew as well. And Alina wears many hats, and today she wears one of the most special hats of being a published author. And she's about to share with us amazing stories about her book, about being a writer, and giving you guys some tips. So without further ado, going to Alina.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Valerie. And thank you everyone for coming. I think somebody has their mic open. You could mute yourself. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. There's the chat box on the side. So if you have any questions for me while I'm talking, I'm going to keep an eye on that. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I know how tired we all are at the end of the day from staring at a screen. So I really appreciate that you took your time. As Valerie said, today I'm going to tell some stories about what it was like for me when I first came to the United States, and then how I used those experiences to turn them into a book, several books actually, and how if you're interested in being a writer, how if you're interested in sharing your stories, I'll give you some tips and ideas for that as well. So I was born in the Soviet Union, what was then the Soviet Union, in Odessa. Today it's Odessa, Ukraine, but at the time it was Odessa, USSR. And I spent the first 6 years of my life living in one room with my parents, which was probably about the size of the room that I'm in right now, which is my bedroom. But the 3 of us, we lived in one room because we lived in what was called communal housing. That's where lots of families were forced to share one apartment because there just wasn't enough space for everybody. So we lived, my parents and I, we lived in one room. In another room, which would have been another bedroom of the apartment, lived another family where they also had a little girl about my age. Their mother lived in a tiny room, which I guess sometimes would be called a maid's room because it's not really a room, it's more like a pantry. And we shared the kitchen. So 2 families shared the kitchen, and we shared one bathroom, which only had a toilet and a sink. And one of the funny things is in some places, because people stole toilet seats, everybody would have their own toilet seat. So when you'd go to the bathroom, you'd have to get your own toilet paper, and you'd have to get your own toilet seat, and you'd have to stand in line for the bathroom with other people who you were living with communally. We were actually very lucky in that my parents got along well with the other family, but sometimes it would happen that the family you lived with, you didn't get along well at all, but you weren't allowed to move because you would need permission from the government before you could move. So you had to live with these people. And sometimes people would do things like somebody would be washing their laundry and they'd hang it up on a line in the kitchen so it would drip. And you'd come back and you'd find out that the neighbors had taken down your laundry and they threw it out the window into the mud because they really didn't like you. Or you might be cooking soup on a stove and you'll come back and you'll find out that they took your soup and they dumped it into the sink because they didn't like you. So we were actually pretty fortunate. and that we got along well, but a lot of other families had problems. We came to the United States in 1977. We went by train. We went from Odessa through various border towns in the Soviet Union. Then we ended up in Vienna, Austria, because the idea was that nobody was allowed to leave the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union's government wanted people to think that it was the best place on earth. So nobody could ever want to leave it because it was so great. But so many people wanted to leave that they allowed you to leave for something called family reunification. That meant that you weren't leaving because the Soviet Union wasn't a great place. You were leaving because you wanted to reunite with a family member who lived somewhere else. So basically, people would leave, for instance, their parents and their siblings so they could reunite with a second cousin that they'd never met. And also, officially, Jews who lived in the Soviet Union could only immigrate to Israel. So you were leaving with documents to go to Israel. But once you got to Vienna, Austria, you could change your mind. The people who wanted to go straight to Israel could go straight to Israel, but the people who wanted to go other places like America or Canada or Australia in Vienna could change their mind. So what happened is, if you changed your mind, they put you on a bus with what's called a one-day tourist visa. You only had permission to be in Italy for 1 day. So they put people on the bus, and the bus went over into Italy, and they checked the papers, and the paper said, oh, you're here for 1 day. But then none of the people came back, because officially Italy was not allowed to take Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union, but unofficially they allowed them to stay. So even though supposedly there were no Russian refugees in Rome, at one point in the 70s, Rome was just full of Russian speakers. So we stayed in Rome. We waited about 4 months in order to get permission to come to the United States. People who wanted to go to Australia often had to wait about 9 months, and people who wanted to go to Canada had to wait a year because the immigration policy was different in those countries. So we were officially allowed to leave the Soviet Union because the United States basically traded us for wheat. The Soviet Union at one point had enough wheat. Ukraine used to grow enough wheat to feed the entire Soviet Union, but because of various political circumstances, the Soviet Union actually needed to import wheat from the United States. And the president of the time, Jimmy Carter, he made a deal which said that we'll send you wheat, but you allow some refugees to leave. So there was all this political machinations going on, but you have to understand something. I was 7 years old. I knew nothing about the political machinations. I knew nothing about life in America. I only knew that I was 7 years old. And one day my parents got me and they said, we're getting on a train and we're going to America. This was a complete surprise to me. They knew, but they didn't tell me because they were afraid I would tell someone else. And if I told someone else, they might get into trouble. So I had no idea. And I'm going to tell you a very sad story. In the Soviet Union, everybody starts school on September 1st. And your first day of first grade is when you're 7 years old. And it's a huge, big deal. All the kids, they dress up in their fanciest uniforms, because there's uniforms you wear for special occasions and uniforms you wear for regular days. And it's a special occasion day. The girls wear white aprons. They put big bows in their hair, sometimes bigger than their heads. Everybody has flowers. Everybody's rushing down the street. It's a huge, big deal. Here's the thing. We left Odessa on September 20th. And my mother, with everything that she had going on, packing up and planning to leave, and she might never see her parents again, she didn't think it was worth the trouble to send me to school for 20 days since we were going to be leaving on the 20th. So everybody my age, everyone I know is running down the streets with flowers. It's their first day of school. I'm sitting at home. I have no idea why. So that's my sad story of the first 3 weeks. And then I get to find out we're leaving and we're going to America. So here's what I had. I had a teddy bear. I don't know how many of you have a toy that you've had from the time you were little, but it's the thing that you hold on to. And when you feel terrible and when you're scared, you have that teddy bear. So I had a black teddy bear. He traveled with me from Odessa to Vienna into Rome. Then from Rome, we flew to New York. From New York, we were going to fly to San Francisco because that's where my father had actually gotten a job. So we were going to go to San Francisco. So we spent one night in New York at the airport, and we were not allowed to leave the airport because officially our papers were for us to go to San Francisco, not to New York. So we get up and we're wearing many layers of clothing because the more clothes we can wear, that means we don't have to put the clothes in the suitcase to take up room, since we only have so much room in a suitcase. Luckily, it's January, so it's okay to wear a couple of layers. Think about the families who did that in July. They were probably a lot warmer than we were. So we get to the airport and we're waiting to go to San Francisco. The teddy bear is missing. I repeat, the teddy bear is missing. I am 7 years old. We are at the airport going from New York to San Francisco, and my teddy bear is missing. Now I'm going to tell you a story about my father. My father is a very practical person. My father says we have to be logical. We have to think things through. We have to only do sensible things. So at this point, we're at the airport, which we're not allowed to leave because we're not legally in America yet till we get to San Francisco. We have only about $10 per person because that's all the money we were allowed to have with us. And our plane is leaving very soon. So what does my very sensible, very practical father do? He sneaks away from the group so that the people who are watching us don't notice that he's gone. He gets in a cab, spends most of our money. He goes back to the hotel. He says, I need to go back to the room that we stayed in. They said that room's already been cleaned. You're not going to be able to find anything there. He says, find me the person who cleaned the room. They find him the person who cleaned the room. She says, I didn't see any teddy bear, but I just picked up the sheets off the bed and I threw them in the hamper. My father says, let's go dig through the hamper. He goes to the hamper. He finds the teddy bear. He gets back into a cab. There goes the last of our money. He comes back to the airport. He gives me the teddy bear. We get on a plane and we go to San Francisco. So when people talk, thank you, Tova. My father would appreciate that. So when people talk about immigration experiences, I'm sure there was important stuff going on and there were politicians making decisions. But to me, the main piece of my memory of immigration is the rescue of the teddy bear. So we moved to San Francisco, where because I'm 7 years old, because in America they start school earlier, they put me right into second grade because I'm 7 years old. I went to a Jewish day school. So that means not only do I not speak English, I also don't speak Hebrew. So I don't speak both languages that they're teaching. That's convenient. I'm the only Russian-speaking kid at the school. I don't know any, here are the two English words I know. I know the word apple because it's in my picture book and it's A is for apple. And I know what an apple is. But now explain to me what this other word, that's the only English word that I know, is. The. Translate the word the. What does it mean when you don't speak English? And everybody uses it over and over again. I just hear the, this, the, that. What does the mean? So those are the only two English words I know. As you can tell by now, I picked up a few more. But one of the important things that I like to tell people who say, you know, I want to be a writer, but English isn't my first language. And my response is always, so what? That doesn't matter in the slightest. English does not need to be your first language in order to be a writer. You need to learn it. You need to master it. You need to know how to use it. But is it vitally important that English be your first language? Absolutely not. So I'm in the United States. I'm the only Russian-speaking kid in my school. I'm just getting the hang of English, but I'm really not understanding a lot of these customs. For instance, did you know that in America, kids wear a different outfit to school every day? That was a big surprise to me. I had one dress. It was a great dress. It had apples and pears at the bottom of it. It was red. And I would wear it. And at the end of the day, my mother would wash it and she would put it on the radiator so it would dry. And then I would wear it the next day. Because who has more than one dress? Why would you need more than one dress? Where would you go? So that was the first thing that confused me. The second thing that confused me is, did you know that in America, when you go to the pool, little girls wear bathing suits with tops? Here's a secret for you. In the Soviet Union, little girls do not wear bathing suits with tops because there's nothing up here to cover. So I go to my first bathing suit and I'm just wearing underpants. Everybody else is wearing either a bikini or a one-piece bathing suit. I am wearing underpants. That was a big surprise. Let's see, what is Valentine's Day? Why suddenly everybody giving me cards? I don't know what this means. And so the next time when I receive a card, I assume it's just a card. It turns out to be an invitation to a birthday party, but I don't know. I don't speak English. I can't read. So that was a surprise. And here's the other thing, Halloween. What does it mean? As my grandmother said, what is this holiday where people go door to door begging for food? How do you explain what this holiday is about? It's fun. And eventually I would get costumes and I would get into it. But my first year, and then I would watch TV, and the children on TV were so strange. The children on TV talked back to their parents. That's not something that you're supposed to do. The children on TV couldn't stay at home alone. I was 7 years old. I had a 6-month baby brother. My parents had to work. I was home with him after school. And on TV, you need a babysitter for kids who are 13, 14 years old. That really confused me. And then food. We ate sausages for breakfast. Apparently, you're not supposed to eat sausages. You're supposed to eat pancakes and waffles, which I didn't know what a waffle was. I'd watch commercials and I couldn't even figure out what a waffle was. Or sandwiches have 2 pieces of bread. All the sandwiches I'd ever seen in my life were just 1 piece of bread with something on top of it. So I was definitely a very weird kid. And here's the weirdest thing. When you get sick in America, they give you like the kind of medicine, they give you like chewy, gummy vitamins or medicines that they even mix nice flavors with. Here's what you get if you're sick in the Soviet Union. And my father had been a paramedic. He worked on an ambulance. So he brought a lot of stuff with him. If you have a chest cold, you take some mustard and you put it on your chest and then you paste something on top of it. And when your skin turns really, really red, that means you're feeling better. Sometimes you take the mustard and you pour it in your socks and you put the socks on. And then when your feet turn really red, that means you're feeling better. There's also this antiseptic called Zilonka, which literally means green, which they put on cuts. It's green. You ever go to school and have your face all covered in green dots? Apparently that's not something they do in America either. And then if you have a chest cold, there's something called banki. Banki are little glass jars. They're about this big. Imagine like they're hollow on the inside. You take something metal and you put some cotton on it. You put some alcohol on it and you light it on fire. And then you take the stick with the fire and you put it inside the banki because that gets rid of the oxygen. And then you take the banki and you put it on your back. And it's like a big suction thing. It's like, here's your back and it sucks up your skin so that it stands up in this perfect red circle. The idea is it makes you warmer so that your circulation gets going. Because one of the things is in the Soviet Union, people didn't have a lot of medicine. People didn't have money. People didn't have medicine. It was very difficult to get medicine. You had to know somebody. So people would make up folk remedies to fix it. So I want you to think about what happens when you put something like a suction on someone's skin and it forms a big red circle. And then you put about 10 of them on a child's back. And then when you remove them, there's this big purple bruise. So your back has basically 9 or 10 purple bruises on them. And then you go to school in America. What do you think happens? They've never seen banki. They're very confused as to why you have 10 perfect bruises on your back. So that was, I had to do a lot. Once I learned English, I had to do a lot of explaining about my food, about my medicine, about all sorts of things. And after I finished at the school where I eventually learned English and some Hebrew, I went to a high school where most of the other kids were also immigrants, but they were usually immigrants from China and Korea and the Philippines. And so we were all kind of a weird group of kids. But I'm going to tell you a little bit later about the good parts that come out from being a weird kid and meeting other weird kids, because I'm a big fan of that. So how did I learn English? I learned English by watching soap operas. You all probably don't watch soap operas anymore, but when I was younger in the 80s, that was really big. And the great thing about soap operas is people tend to have the same conversation over and over again. So it's really easy to learn. Well, not easy, but it's easier to learn English. And my father and mother thought it was a complete waste of time. They don't understand why I'm wasting all my time watching soap operas. But you know what the very first writing job I ever got? It was a job writing soap operas. So my father said, I had no idea that all those hours you were wasting in front of TV, you were actually doing work training. Oh, and I see from Tova saying my grandmother also learned English from soap operas. Yeah, it's because it's the same thing. And then they tell you what happened and they tell you how they felt about what happened. And it's a really good way to do it. And then the next job I got, I was working for ABC Sports, which used to cover figure skating competitions, because I spoke Russian. So I got my job, my first writing job, because I watched soap operas. And I got my next TV job because I spoke Russian. So remember how I told you the things that make you weird, actually the things that are really helpful for the future? That was another example. Then I wrote a book called The Fictitious Marquee. And the way that that book came about was I was trying to sell books. Back in the day, there's a couple of things you had to do differently about selling books. First of all, you had to print the book out. Yes, on paper. This was before the internet. This is before electronics. You have to print it out, 400 pages. You have to print it out. And it's the kind of thing that if the printer got stuck, it would print the whole book on one line because it would go bzz, 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 back and forth. It's called a dot matrix printer, but they were really cool at the time. Trust me, they were really cutting edge. So not only did you have to send your book, you had to pay postage to send your book to the publisher, but you also had to pay postage for them to send it back if they didn't like it. So you had to pay for them to reject you. It's very depressing, but it's what you had to do. And you know how they tell you, I bet they tell you at school, write about what you know, because especially when you're starting out, it helps to be able to write about what you know. So I would try to write about the Soviet Union and Russia, and all the editors were saying to me, Russia doesn't sell. No one is interested in reading about Russia. Nobody's interested in hearing about Russia. So, excuse me, I basically talk so much, that's why I have water. I'm back. So nobody's interested in Russia. So I get a phone call from an editor who said to me, look, I read your book. Nobody's interested in Russia, but I do like your writing style. So the books that I publish new authors in is called Regency Romance. Regency Romance means it's romance novels set during the time of Regency England. She said, do you think you'd like to write one of those? And I said, yes, sure. And then I hung up the phone and I said, what's a Regency romance? Because I had no idea, but I'd agreed, because that's the other thing I tell people. If somebody asks if you can do something, say, yeah, sure, then figure it out later. So I went to the library and I got about a stack of Regency romances and I read through them and I said, okay, I get this. It's like Jane Austen, it's Pride and Prejudice, it's Sense and Sensibility. I can do that. So I wrote 3 chapters and a synopsis, which is a summary of what else happens in the story. And I sent it to the editor, and a week later I get a phone call and she says, I love it. Can you have the rest of the book on my desk by Monday morning? And I said, it's not polished yet, because that was a lot better than saying it's not written yet. So I basically sat down and I knocked out this manuscript and I sent it to her and she bought it. And years later, it turned out it was the very first Regency romance novel that actually had Jewish characters in it. Because while I didn't know much about Regency romance, I didn't know at least a bit about Jews more than I did some other time period. And so that's what I did. And I figured that would make my book different. Remember what I talked about, being different, suggesting something that's different, not writing the same story that everybody else is. So that ended up being the first book I sold. And years later, it was actually even put in a Hall of Fame, as they call something, own voices, people writing about their own culture. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit further down the line about own voices. It was the first own voices Jewish historical Regency romance apparently ever written. And that came out in 1994. So I did those for a while. I did a few more books. And every time I would try to sell a book with a Russian theme, I just heard Russia doesn't sell. And then about 3 years ago, I was having lunch with my agent. An agent is the person who sells your book to the publishing house. They're like the salesperson for your material. And she said to me, you know, Russia is very hot right now. And I said, I'm shocked. I can't imagine why people are suddenly talking about Russia. So she said, do you think you could write a book that's set in Russia? And I'd been trying to sell a book set in Russia for 25 years at that point. And I said, sure, because as I said, if somebody asks you, can you do something? You absolutely say yes. So I wrote the book that became my book, The Nesting Dolls. And The Nesting Dolls is set in 3 different time periods. It's set in the 1930s in the Soviet Union during what was called the Great Terror. That's when Stalin, who was the head of the Communist Party and the head of the country at the time, had decided that people were disloyal to him. So he would have people arrested just because he thought that they were doing something to undermine him. You didn't need to have proof. He would just arrest people. He would kill them. He would deport them to Siberia. It was called the Great Terror because people lived in terror. They didn't know what was going to happen. Then it was set in the 1970s in the Soviet Union, which was the period that I was there. And then it was set in 2019 in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, because I don't know how many people are familiar with Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, but there are a lot of Russian-speaking Jews, either immigrants themselves or children and even grandchildren of immigrants in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. Now, I had to do research to write my story, because even though I knew a bit about the periods, I didn't know enough to be able to write the book. So one of the things that I did is I went back to my own family history. And this is, Lauren lives in Coney Island. So you must be very, very familiar with Brighton. And I like to walk from Brighton to Coney Island all the time. It's a great walk. So one of the things I did is I went to my own family. And I went to my own family stories, because remember how I told you it's the thing that make you unique, the things that make you weird, the thing that you can offer, the story you can tell that no one else can, that's going to make you stand out in the writing world. So some of the stories that I tell in the Nesting Dolls are stories from my own family. For instance, my grandfather's family, they didn't even speak Russian. They spoke Yiddish because they lived in small villages in the Soviet Union and they didn't need to speak Russian. My mother's mother, on the other hand, lived in a big city, and she was actually very proud of the fact that her family was assimilated and cosmopolitan. Oh, Moses, you live in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. Well, then you definitely know what I'm talking about. And so my great-grandmother was very proud of the fact that her children didn't speak Yiddish because they were very sophisticated. And some of the stories that I tell in the book actually comes right from them. For instance, remember before I told you what a terror Stalin was and how he arrested people and how he would deport them and kill them and all of these things. But when he first came to power, he actually allowed Jews to get an education, which they'd never been allowed to do before outside of their own little schools. He allowed them to come to the big cities. So my great-grandfather wrote a letter thanking him, telling him how wonderful he was because his son was able to get an education. My grandfather was 13 years old. 13 years old when he left his village by himself, moved to a major city, lived in a boarding house, worked in a factory by day, went to school at night. I mean, right now, I'm in America watching TV shows where 13-year-olds need babysitters. And my grandfather at 13 years old moved by himself to live by himself because that's just what the times were. And that's one of the stories that I use in this in the 1930s section. In the 1970s section, I actually used a lot of stories from my parents. For instance, my father wanted to be a doctor, but there was a quota on how many Jews could be allowed to go to medical school. They only could pick a certain number. You couldn't take any more than that. So my father was told that he couldn't become a doctor because he wore glasses. And the doctor who told him this wore glasses. So that's the kind of stories that I share. Also that there were a special set of problems called the Jewish problems. They were math problems that were impossible to solve, and they would give them to Jewish students applying to college so that they wouldn't be able to solve the problem, and then they could fail them. And then so they didn't have to give them a spot in college. So I mentioned about the Jewish problems because that was also something that you would know about. And then there's even like little details about life that you might not know about and somebody told you. According to my mother, I didn't eat or sleep for the first 3 years of my life. So you can imagine how fun that was for her. She kept thinking that I was allergic to milk, but the doctors told her, no, it's impossible. A child cannot be allergic to milk. Babies were created to drink milk. But she begged and she pleaded. And so finally, when I was 3 months old, a doctor gave her a prescription for yogurt. I want you to think about this. You didn't walk into a store and just say, shall I get the Greek yogurt or the Chobani? Shall I get the peach on the top or fruit on the bottom? Yogurt was so hard to get. Food was so hard to get. People used to have to stand in line for hours and hours just to be able to get any kind of food. In fact, sometimes people would be walking down the street and they'd see a line and they wouldn't even know what was being sold, but they'd get in line because they'd know that if they didn't get in line, they wouldn't be able to get anything. And, you know, if that was the day that they were selling well, they wouldn't sell avocados, that's silly, cabbage. If that was the day they were selling cabbage, you would buy cabbage and you would figure out what to do with it. If that was the day that they were selling cans of tuna, you would buy tuna. If that was the day they were selling shoes, you would buy whichever shoes they had, whether they fit you or not, because it would be a way to get shoes. And then maybe you could trade with somebody else. So a prescription for yogurt. You couldn't just go into a store and buy yogurt. You had to have a doctor say that you had a medical reason for yogurt. And then by the time we get to the 2019 section in Brighton Beach, that was based a lot on my experiences, the experiences of my friends, such as the fact that the first time an American said to some friend of my parents, "See you later," they thought that meant they would see them later. So they stayed up until midnight waiting for the person to come back because the person said, "See you later." That was just something that they didn't know about. And for instance, my husband, who is African-American, who grew up in New York, he taught me all sorts of things about New York, what it was like growing up in New York. He went to schools where he was sometimes the only brown face there. And that was an experience that he told me about that I was able to write about as well. So this brings me back to what I said earlier about the thing that makes you different. The thing that makes you unique is the thing that you want to write about. And people sometimes ask me, do I need to major in English in college in order to be a writer? Absolutely not. In fact, I would suggest you don't major in English, because majoring in English doesn't teach you about what's worth writing about. It's more important to have something interesting to write about than to have a degree in writing. I tell people major in history, anthropology, neuroscience, psychology, all of the things that explain to you what people do, maybe why they do it, how they do it. So the first thing that I want to stress, no, actually, it's the second thing. The first thing I stressed was you didn't need to have English be your first language in order to be a writer. The second thing is you don't need to major in English. You don't need to major in creative writing. In fact, I think it's better if you major in something else, because then you at least have something interesting and unique to write about. You also don't have to go to a fancy college. People say, well, do you have to go to a college which has a famous name? I went to a state college. I lived at home because that was cheaper and I didn't have the money to live somewhere else. Nobody in the world of publishing cares where you went to college or what your degree is in. They care about, are you telling them an interesting story? And to be fair, they're wondering, are you telling an interesting story someone will be willing to pay money for? Because this is a business. Writing is a business just like anything else. But the thing that makes you you, the thing that makes you unique, is the thing that's going to make your story interesting. I always tell people, are you a person of color? Are you LGBTQ? Are you an immigrant? Think of books like The Hate You Give and all of these books that show the world that there's more than one story. When my daughter goes to school, they actually talk a lot about the single story and the fact that every historical incident is usually told through one person. But the fact is there's so many different views. And the more of an outsider you are, that's what I learned. I was always an outsider wherever I was, from the time I was in the Soviet Union to when I came to the United States as an immigrant. All my life, I was an outsider. But being an outsider gives you a view of the world that gives you something interesting to write. So for people who want to be writers, who want to tell stories, tell your story. Don't try to tell somebody else's, because your story will be what's real. Your story will be what's different. Now, that doesn't mean if you want to write science fiction and you're not an alien or a Martian, that doesn't mean you can't write science fiction. But tell it from your point of view. Make your character someone who's unique to you. So that's the other thing. When I say write your story, I don't mean you only have to write a memoir or you only have to write realistic fiction. If you want to write science fiction, write science fiction. If you want to write mysteries, write mysteries. If you want to write romance, write romance. If you want to write YA, write that, but make it a unique story that's coming from you. Write a story that only you can write. Because if you write a story that anybody else can write, it's really not that interesting for people. Now, there's two different ways to get published. If you want a book that when you walk into Barnes and Noble and you see it sitting on the shelf, that's what's called traditional publishing. That means, remember I mentioned earlier talking to my agent, the person who sells the book, most of the time what you need to do is to get an agent. The agent has to believe that they can sell your story to an editor. And an editor is a person who works in a publishing house where they buy your story. Then they usually work with you on rewriting it, making it as good as they can be. They're an editor, they edit. Then they're the ones who get the cover designed. They're the ones who get the book printed. They're the one who sends the book to the bookstores. That's called traditional publishing. But you guys are very lucky that you actually live in a world where that's not the only thing that you can do if you want to get published. There's something called self-publishing, which means you can take your story and you can write it electronically. Remember how I told you about how we had to print things out and mail the big thing? You don't have to do that anymore. You can just write it on the computer. You can format it. You can upload it. You can put it up on Amazon and you can sell it yourself. Now, what that means is you have to do all the work. You have to edit the story. You have to get the cover designed. You have to let people know that it's out there so they go to buy it. But that's something anyone can do. If what you're interested in is just getting your story out there and getting people to read it, not selling it, there's all sorts of platforms. Like there's Wattpad, which is for fan fiction. If you want to write stories about your favorite TV show, or if you want to write your own original stories. So the fact is, we're living in a time where if you want people to read you and hear your voice, there's so many different ways to do it. And there's so many different places to do it. So one of the things that I really encourage people that if they want to be writers, figure out what you want to write. And you're in a position where you can put it up on the internet and you can get people to comment on it, and you could see what people like. You can see what people don't like. You can sometimes get people to make suggestions and write a story, you know, like you tell a part of it and then somebody else does it. And that is the best way to know if writing is good or bad. Because the fact of the matter is, and with my apologies to all teachers everywhere, my husband's a teacher, teachers are great people. But when you learn to write with a teacher, you learn to write to please that one particular teacher. And it's a very good skill to know, because in the future, you're going to need to write to please different people, editors and agents. And if you want to write for newspapers, that they come with editors themselves. But so you learn to write to please a particular teacher. When you put it out on the internet and you ask for comments, you learn to write to please an audience. And that's a completely different skill. You'll see maybe the part that you think is really exciting, nobody else thinks is very exciting. And the part that you think is kind of boring, somebody else thinks is really great. So that's the best kind of feedback you can get on your writing. And you can start doing it now. Because as I said, you don't need to go to a fancy college. You don't need a degree. All you have to do is want to write and then to just get started. So that's my basic presentation of who I am, how I got here, and how you can also, and remember, don't want to follow in my footsteps because that wouldn't be unique. Walk your own path, but just use some of these things as guidelines. So if people have any questions, whether about writing or anything else, I'm happy to look in the chat box. And if not, then I guess somebody from HLA can pop back on and say what we should be doing next. But for now, I'm looking, to my older sister is an author and ambassador on Wattpad. Yeah, that's great. How has your experience been? Do you want to actually unmute and maybe tell us a little bit about it?
Let me get her for you. I'm the mom.
Hi.
Right back.
So while we wait, because that'll be great, because that'll actually be someone to be able to tell about that in particular. So anybody Anybody else? Do I still own the teddy bear? That is a great question. Yes, I do. He's in another room. You know, you're the second person to ask that. I think the next time I do this talk, I'm going to bring him and have him with me because people are really interested in that. So yes, I do. I had to replace an eye. You know, it fell out and I had to do it with paper and I had to sew the arm back on so it can't really move up and down anymore. But yes, I still do have the teddy bear. So do we have any other questions or do we have her?
Lena, I have a question. It's Valerie. So, of course, well, I'm also from former Soviet Union and I can relate to your story a lot. Your kids were born in the United States. Do you share the story with them? How do they react? Because, you know, sometimes I feel like I'm lecturing my kids. You see, you know, when I was growing up, I had to stand in line, you know, and this and that. So what is your kids' experience when you share your story with them?
Sometimes they find it interesting. Sometimes they really need me to stop talking so that they can go and do something else. But actually, one of the reasons that I wrote this book was I wanted to have a place where I can get my family stories down. So that's a really great question because that was one of my motivations, especially not just mine, but my parents and my grandparents. Some of the anecdotes come from them. So that was one of the reasons I had for writing the book. And one of the things that I urge people to do with their own families is if they can do a family history, because you don't have to write to be published. You can write just for your own family and you can interview relatives and you can do it all sorts of ways. It doesn't have to be written. You could videotape them. You could do a multimedia presentation. One of the things that I suggest is photographs. Photographs are a great way to get people talking because once you show people a picture, just asking who is this and what year is this gets so many stories coming that you wouldn't have known to ask, because it's the kind of thing where you would never ask somebody, well, so how did your family react when Stalin died? But when I showed my mother a picture when I was just trying to get a year, it led to a whole story about how when Stalin died and people were weeping in the streets and how her mother saved all the newspapers with pictures of Stalin because she was afraid that if she threw them out, they'd be arrested for destroying images of Stalin. So that story just completely came out from me just asking her, what year is this picture? So that's something I urge people to do as well, to really talk to their relatives. And if you don't want to write it down, you know, record them on your phone and just then make a collage that you can play it even at a family birthday party. There's so many ways to get stories out there. Oh, so do we have the Wattpad star? Now, I'd love to hear your experience on Wattpad.
Hi, my name is Tyranika. I'm Tabania's second older sister. And I've been on Wattpad for the past 4 years. And I became an ambassador about a year after. So I've been an ambassador for 3 years now, 3 years and 4 months. And for me, the site has changed a lot since I started, but it's very inclusive. It's a great place to meet people, to share, you know, your experiences, to share your voice, and also to get help. But the general sign up age is age 13, but we've put in places now over the years ways to make it safer for younger kids. And if a younger child does want to have an account, we advise that if they have parental permission and, you know, just overall, you know, supervision of it, because there are some things on there that shouldn't be on there because, you know, people, but it's it's really an excellent place. I'm an engagement and outreach ambassador, and an outreach ambassador is something new. And that's basically when anyone signs up for an account, a new account, and they post a story now, we would reach out to them, send them a message, tell them we're happy you're here, we want to help you, we check out their story, make sure everything's okay. And a lot of time, I've made a lot of new friends off of that, just helping them by giving them feedback and letting them know that we hear them, that we see their story, because it's shown that a lot of people leave when you just join. There isn't much of anything. Unless you know people, it's very hard to get people reading your story or people talking to you or make new friends or just meeting anybody. So that's what I do as an outreach ambassador. And an engagement ambassador is someone who, it could be a senior associate or just a regular Wattpadder like myself, who works on official profiles by we host contests, or we work with sometimes corporations who have partnerships like Sony or TNT, who host, they host contests on our sites and they do takeovers. So we are in charge of creating these short books that people can take part in the contest and write their own story. And they have some great prizes out. One of the prizes that TNT had a few years ago back for the Magicians show was, you got, I think, like, it was like a $10,000 in prizes. You got flown out to a site. Yeah, so there's a lot. There's a lot of different competitions, different people, different opportunities. There's opportunities going on right now called Bloomhouse. I don't know if you know who Bloomhouse is. It's like a horror, it's like a horror I wouldn't say organization, but they're in charge of horror on Hulu. And they had a competition that was just running that ended on the 25th, and the prizes were like $1,000 for first place, and the ability to have your story turned into a short, like a 5-minute animated short, or live action.
So that all sounds amazing.
It is. So it's there are tons, I mean tons of opportunities. We now have Wattpad Studios. I don't know if anybody's heard of the movie After, that amazing series. It started off as a Wattpad book in 2015, and the author immediately just went straight to fame. She's huge. It's a 4-part movie series. It has 4 books. There's this another book series called The Kissing Booth that's on Netflix.
It just came out.
Yeah, that's a Wattpad book as well. The author was 14 when someone read her book off of Wattpad, offered her a deal, and that's where she started. That's where the story comes from. There's another one that's coming out, Float. It should be out next year, but they're just, I'm excited talking about it. I've always been, I liked it when I joined a few years after my friends, but the inclusion, the diversity, they're very stand up. It is a Canadian based company. So Wattpad is based in Canada, and the founder is Alan Lau, and he co-founded it with another Asian Canadian back in 2006, when everything was just like on like tiny cell phone screens. And they went from just trying to get somewhere where people could read for free novels and share their voices for just trying, to now this massive place that has partnerships all around the world, in East Asia, Indonesia, Australia, the US, Canada. They're everywhere.
What do you write in particular? What's your area?
So since I had my daughter, she's like sleeping right there. I've taken, I want to say, like a step back from doing a lot of writing and focusing more on just being an ambassador, but I generally write young adult fiction. So I've done some teen fiction. My biggest, I would have to say, was my werewolf story called Pup. And it was great. I loved it. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the characters. I've been rewriting it.
Was it a series? You just kept writing it like a chapter at a time?
So you can serialize. Serializing is the biggest part of Wattpad. You can post 1 chapter every day or however you see fit, but just having that schedule is a good way to build your base. And what I did was, when I started, because I was new to it and I got really sick, I wrote every single day this book and posted every day for like the first month. And then I got sick because I was focusing more on writing than eating or anything else. So
it happens. It's a natural consequences.
Yes, definitely. So I wrapped up this 100 chapter book in just under 4 months. I started midway through July and I wrapped it up on October 31st. And since then I've been rewriting it, which that's the biggest thing for me. But it's just a small part of what I write. I'm writing a romance book. No, it's not. Oh. I'm writing, we call it chick literature or chick lit, which is like based for like new adults. It's just different genres, supernatural, paranormal. I just tend to jump into a lot of different things because I just like to, let my mind wander into whatever I'm thinking about. But some authors, there's this series on Hulu called Light as a Feather. That show is based on a book series on Wattpad called Light as a Feather, same name. So you could choose to dedicate yourself to one series. Every author is different, every person is different, and stay in that lane so that your followers or the people who come to love you and appreciate you know exactly what you're writing or what your style is.
This is not your show.
Or you could branch off.
Great. I'm so glad people are hearing this because it's an opportunity I never had. And I'm so excited that people and aspiring young people, especially, and as you said, diverse people, different voices, people can really make themselves heard in a way that mainstream publishing won't do, because mainstream publisher, what's the same old, same old. So thank you so much for contributing.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Ova, you mentioned that your daughter did. I assume you're talking about Nanowrimo, whatever those initials are, November or something, right? Month, Nanowrimo, Mimo.
Oh yeah,
Yes, NaNoWriMo.
That's
Yes.
it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what that is and how your daughter did it? Thank you so
Sure.
much.
It was so cool to hear your stories. Thank you for sharing your stories. It sounded like my family history a little bit also. My father's family came out of Russia in 1971 and made the newspapers, like when they got here. Brothers reunited.
They would have been one of the very first, because 71, they were only letting out like maybe 10 people a year. Wow.
Yeah. My great uncle was writing letters for 15 years after he found out that my grandfather hadn't been killed in the Holocaust. So when he found out, he spent the next 15 years literally writing. And my great aunt, we had this like family reunion for everyone in 2016. And his widow said that she remembers him waking up in the middle of the night, like, who else can I write to? He wrote to every American politician he could think of and every Russian politician he could think of. And then he coincidentally met Nelson Rockefeller, who got them out.
Wow. That is,
Yeah, so we got a telegram from Nelson Rockefeller. Yeah, very super cool. So at this reunion, they gave out this little like abridged scrapbook to the cousins.
And that's exactly what I was saying about that. You don't have to do it as a novel. You don't have to do it as a memoir. You can do it as a scrapbook. You can do it as multimedia. You could do it as so many different things. Thank you.
Like my aunts are showing the uniforms that you were talking about. This is close.
Yep, white is for festivity, black is for every day. Yeah. Exactly.
I also wanted to say that my daughter did this NaNoWriMo and self-published on Amazon, and then I self-published also before my youngest started school. He has food allergies, so I wrote up a little book as like a photo book, and I showed it to the child activity director at our synagogue, and he's like, you need to publish this so other people can use it.
Yeah.
So I actually did, and it has pictures of him with his reactions, and people were very careful with him when he started school because they don't want it to happen.
Another thing we didn't even get a chance to talk about, we were mostly focusing on fiction and memoirs, but if you're an expert in a particular field, and by expert, once again, I don't mean you have a PhD and you went to a fancy university. You're a mom of a kid with allergies and you have something to share with other parents, or you have experience crafting or anything else. That's another great opportunity. Thank you so much, Tova, that you could do. Even if you're an expert on a particular TV show or role-playing game or TikTok, maybe you're really good at TikTok, you could write guides to things that people could do, and you could either self-publish them, you can sell them through organizations. Like sometimes people, I know someone whose child is a diabetic, and so she wrote a book about things you can do, and it was sold through the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. So you don't necessarily have to go to a publisher. It doesn't have to be online. If you're writing about something that ties into organization, you could do that. Remember, you are unique and you have a unique story to tell and unique expertise to share. And that's what the world wants to hear. Is there anybody else who wants to share? Because I realize we're almost close to the end of our hour and it's almost dinner and bedtime and everything else. Is there anybody else who'd like to talk about their experience either with writing or with publishing or family history or anything else?
I just have a quick question. Can you explain to us who you dedicated this book to?
Oh, that book is actually Igor Kate. He's my cousin. We actually came to the United States together. He was a producer. He made the movie Sing. I don't know if you remember from a few years ago, and the Lego movie and some other things. He died from pancreatic cancer a couple of years ago, and we were very close. And I sort of felt while I was writing this that he was sort of watching over me, as far as, because they're his family stories too, and for his children and everything else. So that's who Igor Kate was. Thank you so much for asking.
Thank you.
All right, so this has been amazing. I am so thrilled to hear your stories. Thank you for listening to me. Valerie, do you want to wrap things up?
I'm actually going to do it on her behalf. I just want to say thank you so much, Alina, for sharing your story with me, with all of us. And thank you to everybody who joined us. We really appreciate it. And, you know, we were glad to have you. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
All right, thank you, everyone. Stay well. That's the most
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Appreciate
Good
you. Bye.
night.